The Velkari were a peaceful species who had never known true war, and their world of crystal towers and singing forests had stood untouched for 10,000 years under the protection of the Galactic Concordance, a union of hundreds of species who believed that violence was a disease that civilized beings had long since cured. And so when Ambassador Kethrani looked up at the burning sky above her beloved city, she could not understand what she was seeing, for her mind had no frame of reference for destruction on this scale, no word in her language that could capture the horror of watching everything she loved turn to ash and flame. The Harrow had come without warning, their black ships appearing from the void like a plague of shadows, and within hours they had torn through the Concordance defense fleet as if it were made of paper. For the peacekeeping vessels had been designed to mediate disputes and rescue stranded travelers, not to fight an enemy that knew only hunger and destruction. Conquest and Kethrani had watched from her council chamber as ship after ship exploded in the darkness above her world, each flash of light representing thousands of lives extinguished in an instant. She was old by Velkari standards, her crystalline body flickering with the pale blue light of wisdom earned through centuries of diplomatic service. And she had spent her entire life believing that communication could solve any problem, that understanding could bridge any divide. But when the Harrow had been contacted and asked to negotiate, they had simply broadcast images of the worlds they had already consumed, planets stripped bare of all life, civilizations reduced to nothing but screaming silence. And Kethrani had finally understood that some things could not be reasoned with. The ground shook beneath her feet as another section of the city collapsed, and she could hear the screams of her people echoing through the smoke-filled streets, families running with nowhere to flee. Go, children crying for parents they would never see again, and the Velkari defense forces were trying to hold the line, but they had never been trained for combat, had never imagined they would need to fight, and they were being slaughtered by creatures that seemed to exist only to destroy. Kethrani made her way through the ruins toward the last functioning communications tower, stepping over bodies that glowed faintly with fading light, and each face she passed was someone she had known, someone she had served, someone whose trust she had sworn to honor. And the weight of her failure pressed down upon her like a mountain, for she was the one who had assured her people that the Concordance would protect them, that the age of violence was over, that they were safe. The tower stood at the edge of the city, its structure damaged but still operational, and the technicians inside were working frantically to keep the systems running, their crystalline forms flickering with fear and exhaustion. And when Kethrani entered, they looked at her with desperate hope, as if she might somehow have a solution, as if wisdom and diplomacy could stop the monsters that were tearing their world apart. She had no solution, no clever words that could save them, but she did have one last option, a protocol that had been created long ago and never used, a broadband emergency signal that would be flung out into the deepest reaches of space, beyond the Concordance borders, beyond the mapped territories, into the unknown darkness where anything might be listening. The chief technician, a young Velkari named Tethor, looked at her with confusion when she explained what she wanted to do. For sending signals beyond Concordance space was forbidden, as there were species out there that the Union had chosen not to contact. Species that were considered too dangerous, too unpredictable, too violent to be welcomed into civilized society, and the protocols existed for good reason. But Kethrani was beyond caring about protocols, beyond caring about the careful rules that had kept the galaxy orderly and safe. For those rules had not stopped the Harrow. Those rules had not protected her people, and if there was even the smallest chance that someone out there might help, she would take it, even if it meant calling upon the monsters that the Concordance feared. She took control of the communications array herself, her old hands moving across the interface with desperate speed, and she composed a message in the universal language that all species could understand, a simple plea that carried all the weight of her dying world. And the words were not elegant, not diplomatic, not crafted with the careful precision she had spent centuries perfecting, for there was no time for art, no time for subtlety, only time for truth. The message read simply, "We are dying, please, anyone." Tethor watched as she activated the broadband transmitter, sending the signal out in all directions at once, a scream into the void that would travel faster than light, bouncing off relay stations and amplifying through subspace until it reached the farthest corners of the galaxy. And he asked her quietly if she truly believed anyone would answer, if she thought help could possibly arrive in time to make any difference. Kathrani did not answer, for she did not know, could not know, and all she could do was hope, a feeling that seemed foolish and desperate in the face of such overwhelming destruction. But hope was all she had left, all any of them had left, and so she stood in that damaged tower and watched her signal race outward into the stars, praying to whatever forces might exist that something, someone, would hear her cry. The signal traveled through systems that had never known sentient life, past dead worlds and dying suns, through regions of space that the Concordance had marked as forbidden, until finally, after what seemed like an eternity, but was actually only a matter of hours, it reached a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in the Orion arm of the galaxy, a world that the Concordance had discovered 4 decades ago, and quietly contained ever since, a world called Earth. On that world, in facilities scattered across every continent, receivers suddenly came alive with the emergency transmission, and technicians who had been monitoring routine traffic found themselves staring at a message that made their blood run cold, for they understood immediately what it meant, understood the desperation behind those simple words, and within minutes, the message had been forwarded to every government on the planet. Fleet Admiral Yuki Tanaka was in her office in Tokyo when the call came, and she listened in silence as the decoded transmission was played for her. The alien voice trembling with fear and sorrow as it begged for help that might never come. And when the message ended, she sat very still for a long moment, her face showing nothing, her eyes showing everything. The Galactic Concordance had told humanity to forget what they were, had encouraged them to disarm, to embrace peace, to leave behind the violent history that made other species so uncomfortable. And humanity had smiled and nodded and done exactly what they were told, at least on the surface, at least where anyone could see. But deep beneath the mountains and the oceans, in bunkers and shipyards hidden from alien sensors, they had kept their true nature alive, waiting for the day when it would be needed again. Tanaka picked up her secure line and spoke 3 words that would change the galaxy forever. Wake the monsters. And across the Earth, in places that officially did not exist, lights began to flicker on, engines began to warm, and soldiers who had trained in secret for exactly this moment received their orders at last. For humanity had always known that the darkness would come again, had always known that peace was merely an intermission, and now the time had come to remind the galaxy why Earth's children had once been feared above all others. The world had forgotten what humanity truly was, but humanity had never forgotten, and in the hours after the emergency signal was received, the Earth began to transform in ways that would have terrified any Concordance observer. For beneath the peaceful surface of the planet, they had dismissed as harmless, something ancient and terrible was waking from its long sleep. In the Ural Mountains, a facility that appeared on no map rumbled to life as massive doors ground open for the first time in 30 years, revealing row after row of warships that gleamed with deadly purpose. Vessels that humanity had been told to destroy, but had instead hidden away, maintaining them in secret, improving them when possible, waiting for the day when they would be needed, and now that day had finally come. Fleet Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood in the Central Command bunker, watching the activation reports flow in from around the globe, and each update brought news of more ships coming online. More soldiers reporting for duty, more weapon systems powering up after decades of dormancy. And she felt something stir in her chest that she had not felt in many years. A cold and terrible readiness that her ancestors would have recognized instantly. She was 63 years old, a small woman with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen things she never spoke about. And she had joined the military before first contact, back when humanity still fought amongst themselves, back when war was not a distant memory, but a present reality. And she had never truly believed that violence could be eliminated, had never accepted the Concordance's insistence that humanity must evolve beyond its nature. The Concordance representatives had visited Earth many times over the past 4 decades, always speaking in gentle tones about the importance of peace, always expressing concern about humanity's aggressive tendencies, always suggesting that the warships and weapons be dismantled for the good of galactic harmony, and Earth's leaders had always nodded and smiled and promised to comply, while deep underground, the real work continued. Tanaka pulled up the tactical display showing the Valkyrie system, studying the enemy positions that intelligence had managed to piece together from the emergency transmissions and long-range scans. And what she saw made her frown, for the Harrow fleet numbered over 2,000 vessels, a force that dwarfed anything humanity could muster. But numbers alone had never been enough to defeat her kind. She had studied the Harrow extensively since their existence became known to the Concordance, and she understood their psychology in ways that peaceful species could not, for she recognized them as predators, pure and simple, creatures that had evolved to hunt and consume. And such creatures had one critical weakness: they had never faced anything that could hunt them back. Her communications officer approached with a tablet containing the latest readiness reports, and Tanaka scanned the numbers quickly before nodding in satisfaction, for the fleet would be ready to launch within 16 hours. 300 ships crewed by men and women who had trained for exactly this scenario, who had prepared for the moment when humanity would be called upon to fight once more. In a barracks beneath the Nevada desert, Captain Marcus Chen was gathering his squad for deployment. And these soldiers were not the soft peacekeepers that the Concordance expected, but warriors who had maintained the old ways in secret, training in combat techniques that alien observers would have found barbaric, learning to fight with weapons that ranged from railguns to combat knives, preparing for a war that many had believed would never come. Marcus looked at the faces of his soldiers, men and women from every nation on Earth, united now by something deeper than nationality or politics, and he saw no fear in their eyes, fierce anticipation that made him proud. For these were the descendants of warriors who had fought at Thermopylae and Stalingrad, who had stormed beaches and held walls, who had never surrendered even when all hope seemed lost. The veterans were already arriving at the staging areas, men and women who had served before first contact, before the Concordance had told humanity to put away its weapons and embrace a peaceful future. And they came with steady hands and clear eyes, ready to teach the galaxy a lesson it had forgotten, that humanity had not survived and thrived by being gentle. Private Sarah Okonkwo was one of the younger soldiers, only 24 years old, and born after first contact, raised in a world that had been told war was obsolete. But she had felt the warrior's call from her earliest memories, had sought out the hidden training programs, had devoted herself to mastering the arts that her species had practiced for thousands of years, understood why. She checked her weapon one final time, a rifle that combined human engineering with stolen alien technology, a device that could punch through armor and shields with equal ease. And she thought about the message they had all heard, the desperate plea from a dying world, and she felt something burning in her chest that she knew her ancestors would recognize, a determination to protect those who could not protect themselves. The ships were loading now, massive vessels designed for war sliding out of their hidden hangars and rising into the sky, blocking out the sun as they gathered in orbit. And the sight was terrifying and beautiful all at once, a reminder of what humanity could do when it stopped pretending to be something it was not. Tanaka boarded the flagship UES Persistence, a dreadnought that had been built in secret over the course of 15 years. A ship designed from the beginning to fight alien enemies with weapons that no concordant species had ever imagined, and armor that could withstand punishment that would vaporize lesser vessels. And as she took her place on the bridge, she felt the ship hum with readiness beneath her feet. Her executive officer, Commander James O'Yelleron, handed her the final deployment orders, and she reviewed them quickly before adding her authorization, knowing that once the fleet departed, there would be no going back, no pretending that humanity was the harmless species the galaxy believed them to be. And she found that she did not care, for pretending had always felt like a betrayal of everything her ancestors had built. The fleet formed up in orbit, 300 ships of various sizes and capabilities, each one crewed by humans who understood exactly what they were about to do. And as Tanaka looked out at the formation, she allowed herself a small, cold smile. For the galaxy had spent 40 years trying to tame humanity, trying to file down its claws and pull its fangs, were about to discover just how badly they had failed. She opened a channel to all ships, her voice calm and steady as she addressed her fleet, and she told them simply that somewhere far away, innocent beings were dying, that monsters were feeding on the helpless, that a cry for help had reached across the stars, and that Earth's children were going to answer that cry in the only way they knew how. The engines engaged with a roar that shook the heavens, and the fleet began to move, accelerating toward the jump point that would take them to the Valkyrie system. And as the ships disappeared one by one into the swirling light of faster-than-light travel, Earth fell silent behind them, waiting and watching, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. In the deepest reaches of space, the Harrow continued their feast, unaware that something was coming for them, something that the peaceful galaxy had tried so hard to forget, something that had been sleeping but was now waking up, very much awake. And by the time they understood what they faced, it would already be far too late. The monsters of Earth were coming, and they were hungry for a fight. The Harrow had conquered 37 worlds without ever encountering serious resistance, and their commanders had grown comfortable in their superiority, confident that nothing in the galaxy could threaten their endless hunger. So when their sensors detected 300 ships emerging from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Valkyrie system, they felt only mild curiosity mixed with anticipation of fresh prey. The Harrow flagship, a massive vessel of twisted black metal that seemed to absorb light itself, turned its attention toward the new arrivals, and the creature that commanded it, a being of shadows and teeth that had personally overseen the destruction of a dozen civilizations, studied the approaching fleet with what might have been amusement. For these ships were small, primitive, clearly belonging to some minor species that had not yet learned its place. Then the humans began broadcasting, and everything changed. The transmission was not a plea for mercy or a demand for surrender, not a diplomatic greeting or a warning to withdraw, but simply a visual record of humanity's history. Images of warfare spanning thousands of years, from ancient battles fought with swords and spears, to modern conflicts that had split atoms and burned cities. And the message was clear without any words. This is what we are. This is what we do. This is what we have done to ourselves. The Harrow commander watched the images flow past with growing unease, for this species had not merely experienced violence, they had perfected it, had turned destruction into an art form, had waged war against their own kind with a ferocity and creativity that the Harrow had never encountered, and for the first time in its long existence, the commander felt something that might have been doubt. Admiral Tanaka did not wait for the enemy to recover from their surprise, and she gave the order to attack with a voice as cold as the void itself, and 300 human warships surged forward as one, their weapons already charging, their crews already locked into battle stations, ready to do what humans had always done best. The first volley was devastating beyond anything the Harrow had experienced, for human weapons were not designed to disable or capture, not built to minimize damage or preserve enemy vessels, but created with a single purpose in mind: to destroy absolutely and completely. Railgun slugs the size of cars tore through Harrow's shields as if they did not exist, punching through hulls and detonating within. The Harrow fleet responded with the weapons that had shattered the Concordance peacekeepers: energy beams and plasma torpedoes that should have been enough to end any threat. But human ships did not behave like Concordance vessels, did not try to evade or retreat. Instead, pushing forward through the fire, taking hits that would have crippled any sane species, and continuing to fight as if damage meant nothing. Nothing. Captain Marcus Chen stood in the command center of the assault carrier Vengeful Spirit, watching his tactical display light up with enemy contacts. And he felt the ship shudder as it took a direct hit to the forward section. But the damage report showed the hull holding, the crew still functional, the weapons still firing. And he smiled grimly as he ordered his pilots to launch. Dropships and fighters poured from the human carriers, small craft that darted through the chaos of battle with reckless speed, and the pilots flew as if they had no fear of death, threading through gaps in the enemy formation that no Concordance pilot would have attempted, targeting critical systems with precision that spoke of endless training and absolute dedication. Private Sarah Okonkwo was aboard one of those dropships, packed in with 50 other soldiers who were preparing for something that the galaxy had not seen in centuries: a boarding action. As it wove through enemy fire, proximity alarms screaming as weapons detonated nearby, but no one flinched. No one cried out, for they had trained for this moment their entire lives. The dropship slammed into the side of a Harrow cruiser, its breaching equipment cutting through the alien hull in seconds. And then the humans were inside, pouring through the opening with weapons blazing, and the Harrow defenders learned in those first terrible moments that fighting humans in close quarters was nothing like fighting the peaceful species they had conquered before. Sarah moved through the corridors of the enemy ship with her squad, clearing each section with brutal efficiency, and the Harrow were larger than humans, stronger in some ways, but they had never faced an enemy that fought with such controlled fury, such disciplined aggression, and they fell back in confusion as the humans advanced. On the bridge of the Persistence, Admiral Tanaka watched the battle unfold. Grim satisfaction, for the plan was working exactly as she had hoped. The Harrow fleet fragmenting as human forces struck at key points, individual ships breaking formation to deal with boarding parties or respond to flanking attacks. And she gave orders with calm precision, adjusting tactics on the fly, exploiting every weakness she saw. The Harrow commander tried to rally its forces, broadcasting commands for the fleet to regroup and concentrate fire. But the humans were everywhere at once, pressing every advantage, refusing to give the enemy time to recover. And ships that had never known defeat were burning throughout the system, their crews dying in ways they had never imagined possible. A Harrow carrier attempted to retreat from the battle, its engines flaring as it tried to reach minimum safe distance for an emergency jump. But 3 human destroyers pursued it relentlessly, pouring fire into its engines until the massive vessel was dead in space, and then boarding parties breached its hull, and the screaming began. The battle raged for 7 hours without pause, and the human fleet took terrible losses, ships destroyed or crippled, crews killed or wounded. But they did not stop, did not slow, did not consider surrender for even a moment. For this was what they had been born to do, what their ancestors had done since the first human picked up a rock and decided to fight back. By the time the Harrow fleet finally broke, only 800 of their original 2,000 ships remained, and they fled in all directions, desperate to escape the monsters that had torn their armada apart. And Admiral Tanaka let them go, for she had a planet to save, and the enemy would carry word of what had happened here to every corner of the galaxy. The human fleet limped toward Valkyrie Prime, battered but unbroken, and as they approached the planet, they could see the fire still burning on the surface, the smoke rising from ruined cities, left by 11 days of Harrow occupation. And every human who looked upon that devastation felt the same cold determination. This was not over yet. On the surface of the dying world, Ambassador Kethrani looked up through the smoke and saw new lights in the sky, lights that were not Harrow, lights that moved with purpose toward her world, and she did not know whether to feel hope or fear, for the monsters she had called had answered, and nothing would ever be the same again. The drop pods screamed through the atmosphere of Valkyrie Prime, like meteors made of steel and fury, and inside each one, human soldiers braced themselves for impact, their faces set in expressions of grim determination, their hands steady on their weapons, ready to bring war to an enemy that had never faced anything like them before. Private Sarah Okonkwo felt the pod slam into the ground with bone-jarring force, and she was moving before the dust settled, kicking open the hatch and rolling out into a nightmare landscape of burning buildings and scattered bodies, her rifle already searching for targets, her training taking over as her conscious mind struggled to process the devastation around her. The Harrow ground forces had been feasting on the planet for 11 days, and the evidence of their cruelty was everywhere. Valkyrie bodies left where they had fallen, buildings stripped of anything valuable, survivors huddling in the ruins with nowhere to go. Something dark and terrible rising in her chest as she took in the scope of what had been done here. Captain Marcus Chen led his company through the streets of what had once been a beautiful city, and he could see the faint glow of surviving Valkyrie hiding in the shadows, watching the humans with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. For they had called for help and something had answered, but they did not yet know whether their saviors would be any kinder than their oppressors. The first harem patrol they encountered was dead within 30 seconds, cut down by precise fire from multiple angles. And Marcus did not pause to celebrate, did not stop to examine the bodies, simply pressed forward toward the next objective. For there was an entire planet to liberate, and every moment they wasted was a moment that innocent beings continued to suffer. The Harrow had not expected resistance on the ground, had grown complacent after days of unchallenged dominance, died in their complacency, human squads appearing from nowhere to strike hard and fast before vanishing into the smoke, methodically working their way through enemy positions with the efficiency of predators who had been hunting for millions of years. Ambassador Kethrani emerged from her shelter 3 days after the humans landed, drawn out by the sounds of battle that had finally begun to fade, and what she saw made her stop and stare in disbelief. For human soldiers were everywhere, moving through the ruins with purposeful urgency, but they were not killing anymore, or at least not only killing. She watched a human medic sprint across an open square, ignoring the sporadic enemy fire that still crackled through the air, and throw herself down beside a wounded Valkyrie child, shielding the youngling with her own body while she worked to stop the bleeding. And when a Harrow sniper took aim at them, a human marksman dropped the creature before it could fire. Watching for threats, Kethrani saw human engineers working to restore power to a water treatment facility, their hands moving quickly over alien technology they had never seen before, figuring out how it worked through sheer determination and trial and error, knowing that the survivors needed clean water more than they needed anything else. And they did not stop, even when their radiation badges began to change color. She saw human soldiers sharing their rations with starving refugees, giving away food they needed themselves, and she saw medics treating wounded Valkyrie with the same care they would show their own kind. And she saw a grizzled sergeant sitting with an elderly Valkyrie who had lost everyone she loved, not speaking, just being present, offering silent comfort to a stranger from another world. The fighting continued in pockets throughout the planet. Harrow holdouts who refused to surrender, who had nowhere to go and nothing to lose. Them down, one by one, with patient, relentless efficiency. But between the battles, they worked to rebuild, to heal, to help, and Kethrani could not understand how the same beings could be both. One evening, as the sun set over the ruins of her capital city, casting long shadows across the rubble, she found a young human soldier sitting alone in what had once been a memorial garden, and he was looking at the shattered stones that had once borne the names of Valkyrie heroes, his expression one of profound sadness, even though he had no connection to this place or its history. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him, and he looked up as she drew near, his eyes showing surprise, and then something that might have been embarrassment, as if he had been caught doing something he should not have done. And she asked him, in her halting understanding of human language, why he sat here in this place of the dead. He told her that he had seen the names on the stones before. The battle had noticed that each one had a small symbol next to it, and he had wondered what the symbols meant, what stories these people had lived, what they had done to be remembered in such a way. And now the stones were broken, and the names were scattered, and he felt that loss, even though he had never known any of them. Kethrani sat down beside him, her crystalline body flickering with emotions she could not name, and she began to tell him about the names, about the teachers and healers and artists and dreamers who had built her civilization over thousands of years, and he listened with an attention that was almost reverent, asking questions, learning stories, honoring the dead in the only way he could. When she finished, the sky was dark, and the stars were beginning to appear, and she asked him the question that had been burning in her mind since the humans arrived, the question that she could not answer, no matter how hard she tried. How could beings capable of such terrible violence also be capable of such profound gentleness? How could the same hands that killed so efficiently also heal so tenderly? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. And he told her that humans knew darkness better than any species in the galaxy, because they carried it inside themselves, had lived with it since the first dawn of their consciousness, had fought against it and surrendered to it, and learned to harness it over countless generations. That was what made them monsters, he said, not the capacity for violence, which many species possessed, but the knowledge of what violence truly meant, the understanding of suffering that came from having inflicted it and experienced it in equal measure. And it was that same knowledge that drove them to protect, to heal, to build, because they knew better than anyone what was at stake when darkness was allowed to win. Kethrani looked at him with new eyes, seeing for the best. First time, not a monster, but a wounded soul, a being who had chosen to fight against his own nature every day of his life. And she understood finally why the Concordance had feared humanity, and why that fear had been both completely justified and utterly wrong. The monsters of Earth were not monsters because they loved destruction, but because they knew its true cost and chose to bear that burden so that others would not have to. The last Harrow stronghold fell 19 days after the humans arrived, and the silence that followed was unlike anything Ambassador Kethrani had ever experienced. A silence not of death, but of possibility, of a world that had been given a second chance it never expected to receive. And as she stood in the ruins of her council chamber and looked out over her wounded planet, she felt something she had thought was lost forever: hope. The human fleet remained in orbit, their battered ships standing guard, while repair crews worked around the clock to restore what could be restored. And Admiral Tanaka had made it clear that Earth's forces would not leave until the Valkyrie could defend themselves, until the survivors had food and shelter and medicine, until the dead had been honored and the living had been given reason to continue. On the surface, human and Valkyrie worked side by side to rebuild what the Harrow had destroyed, and something remarkable was happening. Something that neither species had anticipated. They were becoming friends, learning each other's languages and customs, sharing meals and stories, discovering that despite their vast differences, they had more in common than anyone could have imagined. Private Sarah Okonkwo had been assigned to help rebuild a school on the outskirts of the capital, and she found herself working alongside Valkyrie teachers who had survived the occupation by hiding their students in underground shelters. And when the building was finally complete, she stood in the doorway and watched as children who had known only fear and darkness began to learn and laugh again. Captain Marcus Chen received orders to return to Earth with the first wave of departing soldiers. But before he left, he sought out Kathrani to say goodbye, and he found her in the memorial garden where the young soldier had sat so many nights ago, and she was supervising the placement of new stones to replace those that had been shattered. She looked up as he approached, and her crystalline form glowed with warm colors that he had learned to recognize as welcome. And she thanked him for everything his people had done, for the lives they had saved and the hope they had restored. And he accepted her thanks with the awkward grace of a soldier who had never been comfortable with gratitude. He told her that humanity had come because they heard her call, because they could not stand by while innocent beings suffered. And she asked him if that was truly the only reason, if there was nothing more to it than simple compassion. And he was quiet for a moment before answering with a honesty that surprised them both. He told her that humans needed to fight, needed to have enemies to struggle against, needed to feel that their capacity for violence served some purpose greater than mere destruction. And when her signal had reached Earth, it had given them something they had been lacking for 40 years. Worthy cause. A chance to be heroes instead of monsters. And for that, they owed her as much as she owed them. The Galactic Concordance arrived 3 days later, a delegation of diplomats and officials who had come to assess the situation and presumably to condemn humanity for their many violations of Concordance law. And Admiral Tanaka met them in orbit with a courtesy that barely concealed her contempt for bureaucrats who had let this world burn while they debated proper procedures. The hearing was held aboard the Concordance flagship, a vast and elegant vessel that seemed almost obscene in its luxury compared to the suffering that still marked Valkyrie Prime below. And the charges against humanity were numerous and serious. Maintaining illegal weapons, operating undisclosed military facilities, engaging in unauthorized combat operations, and perhaps most damning of all, refusing to submit to Concordance oversight. Earth's ambassador to the hearing was a woman named Elena Vance, a diplomat who had spent her career navigating the delicate politics of the galactic community, and she sat calmly through the recitation of charges, her expression betraying nothing of what she felt, until finally she was given the opportunity to respond. She did not apologize, did not ask for mercy, did not try to explain away what humanity had done, but instead simply asked the tribunal to look at the evidence, to see what the Harrow had done to Valkyrie Prime, to understand what would have happened if no one had answered that desperate call for help, and then to ask themselves what they would have done in humanity's place. The tribunal members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, for they had all seen the footage, all read the reports, all understood on some level that their own peacekeeping forces had failed utterly to protect the beings they had sworn to defend. And Elena let the silence stretch out before continuing in a voice that was soft, but carried to every corner of the chamber. She told them that humanity had never asked to be feared, had never wanted to be the monsters that civilized species whispered about in the dark, but that fear had its uses, and if the galaxy needed something to be afraid of, something that would make aggressors think twice before attacking the defenseless, then humanity was willing to be that something. She told them that Earth would accept whatever sanctions the Concordance chose to impose, would pay whatever price they demanded, but that they would not apologize for saving lives, would not pretend to regret doing what needed to be done, and would not promise to stand by and watch the next time innocent beings cried out for help that the Concordance was unable or unwilling to provide. The tribunal deliberated for 3 days before announcing their decision, and when they emerged, it was not with sanctions or condemnations, but with a quiet acknowledgement that perhaps the galaxy needed to reconsider its assumptions about violence and those who practiced it, and humanity was invited to remain as a full member of the Concordance, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. Ambassador Kithrani was asked to provide a statement for the Concordance Historical Archives, a first-hand account of the human intervention that would be preserved for future generations. And she spent many days considering what she wanted to say, knowing that her words would shape how the galaxy remembered these events for centuries to come. She spoke of the destruction and the suffering, of the fear and the despair that had gripped her world when the Harrow came. But she also spoke of the humans who had answered her call, of the warriors who had become healers, of the monsters who had proved to be protectors, and she said that the galaxy had been wrong about Earth and its children. Humanity was not dangerous because they loved violence, she said, because they had lived with it so long that they had learned both its terrible cost and its occasional necessity, and they had chosen to bear the weight of that knowledge so that gentler species would not have to. Far beyond the borders of concordant space, in the cold darkness between the stars, the surviving Harrow were spreading a warning to every species they encountered. Do not go to the Orion Arm. Do not threaten the small blue world that orbits the yellow sun. Do not give them a reason to send their monsters again, for Earth's children are awake now and watching, and they do not forgive those who harm the innocent. And on Valkyrie Prime, in a garden that had been rebuilt with human hands and Valkyrie hearts, children of both species played together under the watchful eyes of the stars, proof that even in a galaxy full of darkness, there was still room for light, still hope for something better, still reason to believe that the monsters and the angels might be one, the same.